My name is Christian Lund, and I teach at the University of Copenhagen. And since January, I was elected chairman for the FFU. I don't even know the English. It's the Consultative Committee for Development Research. I want to say a couple of words about why we're having this meeting. It's a meeting that started out as a meeting, then turned into a workshop, and now seems to look almost like a conference. But I think we should just talk about it as a meeting or a workshop anyway. It's increasingly apparent that data collection and fieldwork in developing countries, in many developing countries, poses a challenge. It's always posed a challenge, but increasingly it seems to be that some countries are very difficult to do actual field research in. I think it has created a little bit of frustration among researchers who are preparing to apply to the FFU Research Council, and then all of a sudden the country that they prepared to work in is off the list, and then it's on the list, and then it's off the list. It has created a huge challenge. Sometimes it's not just a challenge for a European or a Danish researcher to do fieldwork. It also poses a challenge in terms of liability for local partners, because research can be very sensitive and can be very dangerous, to say it outright. That doesn't mean that research isn't important and that we should try to find intelligent ways of conducting it anyway. As you've all experienced, I'm sure, these past couple of years with the Corona lockdown and lockup and lockdown again has forced researchers to be slightly more creative in terms of data collection. To do data collection without being actually in the field all the time, but setting up ways of collecting data which means less exposure for the researcher and for the research team in general. And we thought it might be a good idea to exchange some experiences with this, to make sure that the repertoire of research and data collection techniques were not just confined to presence in the field, but also other kinds of techniques. And who are we? It was, I think, prompted by my colleague Maria Pouliot, who will take the floor in a minute, and also Helene Kyd from DIS. So this event is kind of organized by the University of Copenhagen, Department of Food and Resource Economics, the Danish Institute for International Studies, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, DFC, and everybody else who wants to have a piece of the pie. And it was not a long-term preparation, so it's a kind of off-the-cuff kind of meeting, where what we thought would be interesting would be to exchange a little bit of experience on methods that are can be conducted from a distance to the field. If you look at the program, there's a list of people who are supposed to share some experiences in a little while. That was actually my hit list. Some of those people are actually in the field. It's very uncollegial of them to leave and leave us in the lurch like this. But some of them will not be here. So we will go through the people who can actually be here and then let them share their experiences. But even if we have means of getting access to data and do research which does not imply permanent presence in the field, there's a striking absence of discussion of security in general, I think, when you talk about research. So what we would like to do also, and that'll be the second part of today, would be to discuss some experiences around that. And there are not many. But I know that DIS has, since a couple of years back, worked on a security protocol. And we've asked Helene and also Per Schouten from DIS to present that in a brief form in the afternoon, so we can share experiences around that as well. The program is fairly loose. There will be lunch when we are hungry, between 12 and 1, sometime between 12 and 1. I have to say also that this is being streamed. That is why I stand on this cross on the floor. And it will be streamed until lunchtime. Then the streaming will end. So the afternoon will just be the people in the room. I think before we let Marie-Eve, Matthias, and Helene explain some of the experiences they've had with long-distance data collection, we should give the floor to Tove Deinbult from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to say a couple of words about security, situation, research, and the ministry's policy in this respect. So you have a couple of minutes, and then we'll move on to the actual program. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian, and thanks to all of you who are here, either present or on live stream. We are extremely pleased to see the interest in discussing this topic about security related to research in countries with difficult conditions for doing field work. I think 57 of you have indicated in your signing up that you are currently involved in research in high-risk security areas. I think this is a very clear indication of the need to discuss this topic. In the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we have increasingly felt a need to find another approach to deal with security issues in relation to research. Oh, maybe I'm not in the cross. We heard several stories in the fall about Danish researchers who narrowly escaped kidnapping. This is something that raises our hair high up and would make us extremely worried. We had a dialogue with our security people in the ministry, and they said, you can't fund people to go such places. That was just their take on it. This led us to make a list of countries which are ineligible for security reasons, countries which would otherwise be on our list for applying for FFU grants, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Somalia. Adding to our concerns was also that we understood that not many Danish universities paid the necessary attention to security issues once grants were secured. It is the applicant, the Danish university, which has the duty of care in situations where researchers are exposed to danger. Legally, it's not the Ministry of Foreign Affairs once we have paid the money. That doesn't mean that we're not concerned. We're deeply concerned, and we really want to discuss this. But we also want to make an effort to stress to university management the importance of stepping up security considerations and preparation. Christian talked about finding intelligent solutions, and we do admit that it was not the most intelligent solution that we just made a list of countries which were too dangerous to work in. And this was the limitation of our approach was clearly underlined when a few weeks later we sat in the FFU Research Council, and it was not Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Somalia which were the issue, it was Ethiopia. And again, we were forced to make a quick decision. We had 3 project applications which were found eligible on other criteria, but not on the security considerations. And since we had to make a decision and these were not found feasible in a short-term perspective, we could not fund the 3 projects as they were. The reason that we made the other decision quickly about the 4 countries taken off the list was that we were just about to launch the next call for the first round of the current process of FFU applications. Some of you approached us, and we are deeply thankful, Marie-Eve and Helena, that for your suggestion that we could look at this in different ways instead of operating with negative and positive lists, eligible and non-eligible countries, that we could look into how we are working in these countries, and that much of the solution might be in the way that field work is undertaken. And when DIS and University of Copenhagen approached us and said, should we just make this workshop and start discussing what we can actually do, we thought this was a brilliant idea. And we're so pleased to see that many of you seem to think along the same lines. It is, of course, important that we are now avoiding to focus on the protection of Danish-based researchers. The concern for researchers based in Danish universities should not be at the expense of our partners in the global south. It's important that we find ways which are as safe as possible for all researchers involved. And let me add that we would consider it an added value if these new field working methods could imply that some of the researchers from the global south get a more prominent role in research design and decision-making research related to the research. As Christian said, it's not fieldwork methods which will solve all our challenges. We also need to look at the security setup in each of the institutions which have received research grants. We plan to increase requirements to the security setup, and I'll elaborate on that in the afternoon when we're discussing this topic in particular. And we're ready to fund it over and above the costs of the research project. We are aware that there have been some considerations if you take a HEAT course, hostile environment awareness training course, which is a very good idea to have before you go to one of these countries. If you take this will be as it has been until now. This would have to be funded off your total grant, and there may be an inclination to think that, okay, we can do without it, and then we spend the funds on more man weeks. But we will fund this above the research costs. We will also request reflections in research applications about contingency planning. If it's not possible to undertake the proposed project, what is plan B? If we cannot work with government authorities for political reasons, and that's a requirement sometimes imposed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, then what? Who can we work with then? If we cannot work in a particular region or a particular country, what do we then do? If these things are elaborated in the research application, it'll be much easier for us to accept research applications in countries where there's suddenly a civil war or a major crisis, or Denmark is kicked out, or whatever is happening. I think the recent, 11 days now, the terrible war ongoing in Ukraine really stresses the need to think along different lines, that we cannot just plan a research project for 5 years. So many things can happen during the process, and we need to be much more agile and flexible in the way we're thinking about this. The Danida Fellowship Center, DFC, has assisted in the organization of this workshop. DFC is helping us in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs with all the administration related to research projects. I'm sure you know them very well. And they will start editing the research application format for phase 2 based on these our considerations today, and then we hope that this will take us one step further, a more safe way of doing development research. So I look forward to our discussions today, and again, thanks a lot for the interest in this topic.
So while we're solving the technical issues here, I think it would be nice for us presenting just to get an idea of who's in the room. So I know some faces, but who's a researcher? Can you just raise your hand? All of you, okay. And who's from University of Copenhagen? And these? Austin, who else do we have? DTU? DTU? Yeah, almost. Okay, okay. Sorry?
Danish Institute Against Corruption.
Okay, thanks. Great.
Good, isn't it?
Perfect. And now I'm on the cross, and it should all work. I'll start speaking now. So my name is Marie-Ève Pouliot, and I'm an associate professor at the Department of Food and Resource Economics at the University of Copenhagen. I'm going to talk to you about two types of two data collection instruments that we've been using successfully both in Burkina Faso and in Ghana. In the past few years, actually, I'm mostly interested, this research project here, what I'm going to be talking about, focuses on issues related to livelihoods and access to resources for women who collect shea kernels, shea nuts in Burkina Faso and Ghana. And of course, I'm the one speaking today here, but I'm presenting results that have been analyzed and generated by my colleagues, François, Sophie, and Nerea. And also you'll see that there was very little presence of Danish or Western researchers in Burkina Faso and Ghana while we collected the data. So I also have to say thank you to all the local researchers that have been working with us, especially Fatima and Khadidia, Hilda and Rashida in Ghana and in Burkina Faso. So, right, I'll start with actually my take-home messages, so you'll get the conclusions first. Both the remote collection of survey data and photo voice are excellent for collecting quality data. So it's not a plan B, it's actually a plan A. It works both when researchers from Denmark can be present in the field and also when they cannot be present in the field for issues of security, COVID, or other reasons. When presence in the field is impossible for Danish researchers, both data collection methods require already established networks of researchers and assistants and previous knowledge of the field. So I wouldn't advise anybody who doesn't have experience in Burkina Faso to just think that they can do a photo voice or remote collection of survey data in Burkina Faso. It's important to build on already existing networks. Both data collection methods require a lot of rigor and a lot of training of local researchers and enumerators. What we can conclude now that we've been collecting data with those methods, both in Ghana and in Burkina, is that when the presence in the field for Danish researchers is impossible, using photo voice or remote collection of survey data has the added benefit of giving a lot of space for local researchers. So we weren't there, we couldn't help the local researchers to collect both quantitative and qualitative data, and that made place for a lot of new initiatives that maybe wouldn't have taken place if we were there and had more dictated what should be done. So we're actually very positive about those methods, especially when used when no presence from Danish researchers is possible. So I'll start with remote collection of survey data, and it's very simple, and probably many of you have heard of this before. So what is this? It is the collection of survey data using technology, so tablets or smartphones. Once the researcher or the research assistant collects the data on a smartphone or on a tablet, The data is uploaded to a drive or a cloud and is accessible to researchers in Denmark to see and act upon if needed. So this leads to the most important strengths of this method. Researchers who aren't present in the field can follow the data collection as the data is being uploaded in the cloud, as it's being collected and uploaded. And this allows for very close communication between the researchers who aren't in the field and the researchers or research assistants who are collecting the data. The costs of this, at least based on our experience, are minimal. Of course, the researchers, the local researchers, need a tablet or a phone. But we've been doing this in Burkina Faso, Ghana, DRC, Argentina, and Peru. All the assistants or the researchers we were working with had a smartphone that could collect data before being hired for the project. So we didn't have to invest on buying any new pieces of technology for this part of the research. Another added benefit is that researchers don't have to carry bulky amounts of papers. It's pretty easy to travel to the field with only a smartphone or a tablet. And there's no need, of course, to digitalize the data. It's digitalized as it's collected, so it's also saving time. There are, of course, a few limitations to this type of data collection instrument. And well, the first one is just like any other type of survey. It's the data that this type of survey generates becomes more meaningful when it can be combined with more qualitative data to understand the hows and the whys. Specific to remote data collection here is that it requires frequent connection to the internet. And this is important because the data is saved on the phone until it gets uploaded to a secure server. Ideally, you'd like your local researchers to have access to internet once a day, both to ensure that you don't lose data. If you lose your phone and data is only on the phone, then data is gone, right? But also to ensure that you can follow up as a researcher here in Denmark or anywhere else. You can follow up with the data collection, look at what's going well, the questions that aren't working maybe not so well, maybe some misunderstandings and so on. And as I mentioned before, to make a good survey, you need to have a good knowledge of the field circumstances. And to collect this type of data, you also have to have access to qualified research assistants. That's really important. So how the practicalities here, just a few bullet points. And of course, you're welcome to talk to me in the break or just ask questions after if you want to have more details about this. But in 2021, we actually conducted a survey on a little over 1,000 households in both Burkina and Ghana, using in 24 different communities and with the help of 12 research assistants in Ghana and in Burkina Faso. How did we work? We designed the first draft of the survey here in Denmark, and we shared the first survey draft with our local research assistants in Burkina and Ghana to get their feedbacks and their inputs. Then the survey was amended based on the feedback and inputs. It was coded, so it could be used on a tablet or a phone. And then we organized, and this is really important, we organized an online training with all the local researchers. And this is a selfie of one of the trainings. So it was a 3-day training and then a pilot testing of the survey, where we could, of course, see the data that was collected and make sure that the questions seemed to be well understood and get feedback from the team and so on. And then we had the data collection period with daily contact with research assistants via WhatsApp and frequent data checks here in Denmark to make sure that things were going on as planned. Okay, so that was about the remote collection of survey data. Now I'll move on to something that is perhaps a little less known. So it's a method called photo voice. Who's heard of photo voice before? Very few of you, okay. So this is quite different type of data collection instrument. It's a visual, more participatory, action-oriented type of data collection instrument. Essentially, what we need to do here is to give cameras or smartphones with a camera to participants who will then be asked to visually narrate their story. So the participants, they take pictures, and then you conduct interviews based on the pictures taken by the participants. And you'll see examples, so it will probably get clearer. So the strengths of this method, if I have to start here, is that this gives the participants the opportunity to set the agenda and choose what they will talk about to a much larger extent than if you're using a preset list of questions, an interview guide, for example. Participants get to take pictures and share them with the researchers, and those pictures become a common point of reference between the researchers and the participants here, something to take point of departure from. Here we have just the examples. We have many pictures. These are 3 pictures taken by participants in Burkina Faso. It's 3 women who have been selected, Shia collectors. These women had never had access to their own smartphone before, and they were, before starting, very untrained in taking pictures. So you can see actually the results are pretty nice. They took very beautiful pictures, and the most beautiful part is actually the interviews that were based on those pictures. But I'll get to that in a minute. There are some limitations. So here, actually, I said before that for our local assistants, researchers, for the collection of survey data in Burkina Faso and Ghana, we didn't have to invest in smartphones. Here, though, we're dealing with participants, Shia, not collectors in Burkina and Ghana, who don't have their own smartphone. So we had to buy smartphones for them. But that can be found pretty cheaply. So we bought phones for 340 kroners each in Burkina and Ghana, and they worked really well. Actually, that's the phones that took those pictures. And the women could keep the phone afterwards. So it was a kind of compensation for the time spent also. Again, another limitation here is that this method also requires previous knowledge of the field circumstances to, of course, understand and analyze the data that's being collected. And it requires access to very qualified research assistants who can conduct those interviews based on the pictures. How does it work? Or how did we make it work? In 2021, we conducted Photo Voice with 24 women in 4 communities. So 2 communities in Burkina and 2 communities in Ghana. Here, instead of training the local researchers online, we actually traveled to Ghana and met with both our local researchers from Ghana and asked the researchers from Burkina to travel to Ghana to meet us. So that was done a little bit south of the border between Burkina and Ghana, where we had a workshop, a training workshop here. Our assistants or local researchers are already experienced at conducting interviews. So the workshop was not about how to conduct an interview, but it was more about how to use pictures to conduct the interview and how to train the participants to take good, meaningful pictures. After the training, we chose the participants, so which women should we work with, and we chose them based on the results from the survey that I just presented. And then we asked we approached the participants, we asked them to give their consent. And by the way, we have received the consent and we're also allowed to share their pictures with you today, right? And then we gave a very basic training in photography to our participants. Again, there are people who have never owned a smartphone or a camera. Some of them had never taken a shot with a smartphone. So it's very basic. It's about how to focus, how to zoom, how to crop a picture, and so on. It took some hours. And then those participants were given 10 days to take as many pictures as they wanted of anything. And well, we had 12 participants. Some of them took 25 pictures in 10 days, and some took 500 pictures. So it varied a lot how much they decided to use the smartphone to take pictures. It also varied a lot with age. In general, the younger participants took a lot of pictures, and there was an older woman she took pictures, but not as many as the others. And then on the day of the interview, these participants had to select 10 pictures they wanted to talk about. So we didn't want to hear about 500 pictures, but only the 10 pictures they chose, which they wanted to talk about. So that's why I say this is where they set the agenda. I want to talk about my grandson who was born this year. I want to talk about my business in trading Shia. And then the types of questions we would ask during the interviews our local assistants would ask is, what do we see on this picture? Why did you choose this picture? What do you want to tell us today? How does this picture make you feel and why? And the last question was quite interesting. Can you give this picture a title? And here, so I hope you get an idea of what photo voice is by now. This is just concluding here with examples of pictures we got and the type of material we could get with this type of data collection. We're interested in Shia and the livelihoods and access to resources. And with regards to Shia, there were a lot of women mentioning how trade and collection of Shia was a business of their own. And they showed us this through pictures. There's the picture here taken by Amina at the bottom. So when she was asked what's on the picture, she said, my Shia tree. And then the local assistant tried to make her say that her face was also there, but she said, well, yeah, that's the point. It's my Shia tree. So she wanted to show it was her tree. And we had also the picture taken by Fuseini here, who wanted to show that it's her business. She sells those Shia nuts and she has control. She could invest in other businesses, but Shia is really her business. So they wanted to show us that it was a business of their own. And here you have just an example of one of the 12 women. That's the pictures she chose to talk to us about. And it really shows she wanted to show all the activities she's involved in and all the ways that she can generate an income or a living. So she showed us that she grows maize, she sells fabrics, she grows peanuts, and she makes Shia butter, she trades Shia kernels, and so on. So it was really important for her to show us how she makes a living. And this allowed us to touch upon, of course, different topics during the interview. So the interview with the woman who showed all her different businesses, we could talk about her sense of ownership, her autonomy in income generation and in spending, the bargaining that she has within the household, with her husband, and the meaning of each of those activities that she uses to earn a living. All right? And this is my last slide. I'll just get back to the take-home messages that I presented at the beginning. So both types of data collection are excellent, whether you can be in the field or not in the field. When you cannot be in the field, you need to know your field beforehand, and you have to have a network of researchers that can work with you. If you're not in the field, or if you're in the field, you need to have a very rigorous approach to using those data collection instruments and ensure good training. And we think that when you cannot be in the field, it actually gives a lot of space for local researchers to set the agenda, to work much more independently. All right, thanks.
Maybe if you have a few questions, we could take them now, but otherwise I think we should move on and then toward the end of the morning session, talk across the presentations. But if there are any specific questions, it should be now.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so let me ask two questions. The first one is, you did mention the latter part of the presentation. You mentioned that you asked those who you asked them to choose some pictures.
Yeah.
To talk about.
Yeah.
And then my question is, how do you ensure consistency in the result? So if you have about 100 participants, are you then going to have 100 different responses because you choose different pictures? How do you make sure you are?
So This is not, I wouldn't advise in having 100 participants here. The interviews based on the 10 pictures could take several hours. So it's qualitative material that needs to be analyzed. So it generates a lot of material. It's more a way to generate qualitative data. And consistency is not a concern here. So we were interested in finding out about women's livelihoods. So we selected women who are heavily involved in the Shia sector here. And we were interested in finding out how they live their life, what is important to them. So issues of consistency here was not a problem for us.
So that brings my second question.
Yeah.
How, to which extent can we applicable the photo voice applicable to other kind of data? For example, if I am involved in a field experiment where you have to collect data on a plant or on an animal, how can I use this photo voice in experiments?
You need to have humans involved. That's the important or the interesting part, right? To see how humans, human respondents take pictures and relate to them. If you're working with animals or plants, I don't think this is the right type of data collection for you. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I have a question, and it's a way more practical question, but about the instruments. So, did you have any issues about the fact that these are actually quite valuable instruments? I was involved in some collection in Colombia where they are using tablets in quite harsh areas, and some of the researchers, the investigators, the local investigators, they didn't feel comfortable walking around alone with a tablet.
Mm-hmm.
And then we would have to go for the option of just bringing the pile of papers.
Yeah.
So I was just interested to hear whether this was something you encountered in your research and how you dealt with it.
Actually, we didn't.
That's amazing.
And that's maybe because we use, I think, using researchers' own phones.
Yeah.
It's not so fancy, shiny, right? Sometimes it's the phones that they have and use. So it's not so special. But still, in the DRC, we used tablets that we had purchased in Denmark. And we didn't hear from the local researchers that there were problems walking around with tablets. So I don't have experience with that, unfortunately. Yeah. Thanks. Should we take questions, or how do you want to? There are many questions.
Let's take 3 more, and then if you have a really good question, it will preserve really well to the end of the session. If it wasn't a good question, it will just evaporate during the next hour. So let's take 3 more.
Okay, we'll take Isa, and we'll take you. Or is there a question here also? Okay, so we'll take Isa and you, and then the woman here in the middle. Yeah.
Thank you for educating us on this method of collecting data. My question is, I realized you were selecting 10 pictures out of the lot of pictures that the respondents took. So I want to find out the 10, is this a standard or that was just a own cutoff?
There's a little bit of literature on this, and there's no standard. So some researchers have chosen 4 pictures, 5, but it was the first time for us using this method. So we tried to hit the average of 10. Also bearing in mind that some of the pictures, maybe the respondents wouldn't have a lot to say about. Maybe they just want to show they had a new child and he's cute or she's cute, right? But then some of the pictures, there would be more material to deal with. And I would say, based on our experience, 10 is perhaps the upper limit, because the interviews tended to be quite long, talking about 10 pictures. So if I had to start again, I would perhaps go for 6. Yeah. At least we didn't run out of things to talk about, that's for sure, in the hours, yeah. Yeah, thanks, Isa. Here?
Did you have any open-ended questions in the survey, and how did that work on this? And then what kind of platform did you use?
We did not have open-ended questions. It doesn't work really well in a survey. Everything is coded. And that's also why we used the photo voice here to try and understand the hows and whys. So it worked really well in combination. Platform is a good question. So back in the days when we started this type of work, we used ODK. Some years back, because of GDPR issues, the University of Copenhagen started advising us to use Survey Exact, and it also works. I think Matthias will talk about databases or how to secure data in a second. But the point is that with SurveyExact, the server is situated is more secure than with ODK. But there are many platforms that can be used. Yeah. Thanks. Yes?
The protocol works for scientific research. The individual women who had children with deviant behavior, they were not only have the never put on the full length on the inbox function.
Mm.
Would it be protocol work with our scientific research? I understand this work is your research.
So thanks. That's a really good question, which I didn't actually talk so much about here. You're right that the topic of our research is not sensitive as such, but what the local researchers told us is that they were very surprised that some women chose to talk about quite sensitive topics. And you cannot foresee this. So it's the women themselves who chose the pictures, and then the pictures led to abortion, suicide, and very sensitive topics. And the researchers reflected on the fact that when you give space for participants to talk about what they want, you need to be prepared also that maybe some sensitive topics will come up, right? So I cannot say in your case whether it would work. It would have to be tried. I think it's also has to do with culture and the types of participants that you select, but it actually worked in our case pretty well. Yeah. I can talk to you more about it later during the break if you want. Yeah. Thanks. Should we stop it here?
Yes, let's give the floor to Matthias,
Yeah.
who will also give a short presentation before we move on to the lead. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Maria. Very, very interesting also to hear your experiences. My name is Matthias Rasmussen. I am associate professor at the same department of Food and Resource Economics. I work in Latin America, so my projects are not FFU projects. They are financed by the Danish Research Council. I'm talking about two projects here. One is called Sokoko, the social contract of conservation, which is about the relationship between protected areas and local communities in Peru, and a project called Leaks, which is about resource politics. In my part is in Argentina. I collaborate with Stine Krøyer from anthropology and Penelope Anthias, who's currently at the So I have, I'll talk about, the title that I was given was called Interviews on the Phone. I haven't used the phone at all. It's other platforms. It was initially Skype, then Zoom and WhatsApp. And I'm trained as an anthropologist, and I'll talk about how these interviews became part of my work, but they can't stand alone. But I'll tell how they actually can work quite well, I think. And I have basically four points that I want to make or want to sort of think about. The first is how well acquainted are people with this kind of communication. I found that in my work in Peru, at community level, this would not have worked. People are not communicating online. They don't have much access, and that's not how they communicate. In Argentina, people use WhatsApp all the time, the people that I've been working with. So there's a form of communication that it resembles what they would do otherwise. And that really makes a difference. I want to also, a second point that I think is important is sort of the conditions for dialogue. How can they, what is the context of these interviews? That these interviews, in order to avoid them becoming extractive, in order to sort of to make sure that this is actually part of a conversation where people are also involved in defining what is this about, what is the purpose of this. It's important to think of these interviews as part of a longer sort of process of engagement and commitment. And that relates to the third point, which is about trust. What are the conditions of trust that shapes the outcome of these interviews? That because interviews are intimate situations, you'll share sometimes quite sensitive knowledge, even if that's not necessarily the intention of the interview. So what is the kind of social context that these interviews are embedded in, and how do you work through that context online, mediated but through WhatsApp, or through well, mainly through WhatsApp, and then the last point is this question of how do these interviews relate to other forms of empirical work. And similar to Maiev, I think the important thing is that without profound knowledge of these places, interviews online will not make much sense. So I want to think about how do these interviews relate to prior knowledge and to ongoing empirical commitment. So I'll talk about 3 different experiences or strategies. The first one is from a project called the Social Contract of Conservation, where the online interviews were part of the original research design. So I'd written this project proposal, which is a project that I've been running together with Maria, and this was in the design. What we wanted to do was to interview. We wanted to understand the strategies of protected area management in relating to communities. So we had so the people that we were interviewing were people who work in offices and who are sort of, they have a laptop, that's part of their work, and it was also therefore part of their work to look into a camera, and even more so once COVID began. But this data collection actually began before that. And that was developed in dialogue with the head of community relations in Lima, whom I've known since 2010. So we had when I did my doctoral field work, he was the head of the national park where I was working. So we had a fairly close relationship for a long time. So it was easy for me to approach him and say, I think this could be interesting. How should we do this? And then we actually spent, I think, almost a year sending back and forth ideas about how to design there was an underlying sort of survey, but then for each of the questions, we had open-ended, you ask, right? And since I'm sort of a qualitative researcher, I was more comfortable with the with the open-ended. That's my safe space, so to say. So they answered the sort of the concrete question: how many park wardens do you have? And then we talked for a long time about what do these park wardens do. So it worked fairly well. I think I had one interview where I felt this did not really, this was not a good interview, and there should be space for those as well. But most of them lasted more than an hour and a half, and really were quite rich in how we could work. Um, and I think they worked because we had support from the central office, so they communicated that it was important to them that people participated. So it was the head of the parks in almost all of the interviews who spent quite a lot of time on this. And it also worked because I've been working in Peru for a long time and have a good and detailed knowledge of the different places, the problems, the sort of agrarian politics, and so on. So it was, I think, there was quite a lot of knowledge to be mobilized within these interviews. Just to mention this, that actually it is also a method that is recognized apparently by the scientific community, because I had just published this paper based on those interviews. The second is also the Sococo project, the social contract of conservation, but in Argentina. Fieldwork there was quite literally disrupted by COVID-19. Maeva and I were in the field when we had to go back because the borders were closing and so on, and we had to figure out what to do then. One part was the survey, which was on paper for similar reasons that you mentioned before, and we decided actually to shift to an online platform in order to sort of continue data collection once that was possible, but also to get the data that was already on paper. So that there was an ongoing dialogue based on the survey, and as that sort of developed, we decided to try to train some of these assistants that had done a really good job in the survey to also do interviews. These were young people from the communities. So these are not, they're not trained researchers, but they're people who have a profound knowledge of the place that they're living. And they had a profound interest in understanding better the experiences of the older generations in relating with the national park. That's a very complicated story that I'll not go into, but there's a lot of sort of resurgence of indigenous identities, understanding where you come from, and so on. And these interviews feed into that because this is ongoing into those concerns. So we spent quite a lot of time developing the interview guidelines together, and that was in itself quite valuable for me to understand what are the kinds of questions that you find relevant and important to pose. We had a fairly long debriefing after each of the interviews, talking about what was this interview about, what did you learn, what did surprise you. Also, more practically, were the questions that were difficult to understand, and so on. Because so those were also those debriefing sessions, also hugely important for me in building up more knowledge and understanding of this. Data is then transferred using KU's system called, well, it's there. Sometimes it has several homepages, but it's called SIF, basically, which is sort of a double authentication platform. Quite complicated to set up, I should say. If any of you have experience with that, you'll know that it requires some digital training. Also in the end that in Argentina, it took some time to sort of get it working, but then now that she is it's particular one person who's doing this right now. Now that she has the connection, it works well. And it complies with all the GDPR regulations and so on. Again, I want to stress sort of the relations of trust, that this is based on a long-standing dialogue. I included the upper picture here, which says that it's prohibited to enter Mapuche territory without free, prior, and informed consent. And this is important because there was a long process of gaining that consent with Mapuche authorities in this area, and defining what was this project about in the first place. And that long process also created a commitment from the community members saying that we want this project also to succeed. And that helped in both terms of finding people who would want to do the interviews, but also in finding people who are willing to be interviewed and to share this knowledge. Great. So that's a second way of doing remote interviews by sort of a satellite interviewer who's then but in very close dialogue, both on and that dialogue is primarily on WhatsApp, audio messages and so on. And then I did the last example is related to my project called Leaks, that so Coco had to be adjusted. I had to adjust the method, we had to adjust the methods due to the circumstances. Leaks I had to rethink, because what I had imagined could not, was impossible because of the COVID-19. I used here, I decided to focus on a particular political formation called the Social Environmental Assemblies, that are neighborhood groups struggling against different forms of extractive industries. So I reached out to them, and I did that through a common acquaintance. So I asked people, do you know someone from these assemblies? And that made a tremendous difference that they did. Because then I could use I was basically using my social network from the previous project, my ongoing engagement with these issues. But I did long interviews, 1 to 2 hours, with the members of these assemblies. Here's important to stress that these members of the assemblies are usually sort of middle-class people. Not so they are, in the sense that they're not financially well. Few people in Argentina are these days, but they are well educated. They're teachers working in health stations and so on. And because this was during COVID-19, they already spend a lot of time on online platforms. So Argentina had a fairly strict lockdown. So they spent quite a lot of time in their homes. And at some point, at least, these interviews seemed like a welcome distraction to sort of keep the social movement going as well. I think it's important that these were framed as the beginning of a longer commitment, that these interviews did not stand alone. Though I didn't know people, they knew that we would get to know each other. And that created also I think, an interest in engaging with this. It's quite a sensitive issue. People live with a lot of sort of different forms of silencing from the authorities. They have experienced researchers who were sort of supposedly doing good, but then ending up working for extractive companies. So there was a lot of mistrust in the beginning for some, and that distrust was partly dismantled through these existing social networks. But that trust is also something that has to be worked on continuously, but that it can happen. And I think that I've just come home from Argentina a couple of weeks ago. This is from this is a Facebook post from one of the meetings with one of the assemblies, and you can see that I'm sitting in the middle there. And this is just to say that these interviews, standing alone, I would not. I don't think I would feel comfortable using them for anything. But now, since I've been there, this is a part of an ongoing commitment, building trust through dialogue, continuity. I'll go back. We'll continue working on this, and I'll continue sort of doing these interviews until I get back again. I do also have a local assistant, also helping me on this. So, just to end, I formulated these not as sort of commandments, but as I had done that first with a lot of should and so on. But I think it's more productive, I think, to pose questions, right? I think the first question, when thinking about interviews, is how familiar are people with this kind of communication? My experience was in Argentina that since they are quite familiar, it was not a strange space for them to engage with. I also say that the conditions for engaging in dialogue before, during, and after the interview, to think about the interview not as an isolated event, but as something that is sort of part of a ongoing dialogue, where the interview becomes a particular moment in that dialogue, but it has a before and an after always. And the relations for trust and commitment, both that conditions the interview, that makes it possible in the first place, but also how the interview in itself is a moment of building trust and so on. The fourth point is the relationship between the interview and other forms of on-the-ground fieldwork. And then the final point is just to say that the relationship between interviews and other work commitments, I actually ended up realizing that it's quite demanding. Because of the time difference, most of these interviews are at night. And I had initially just said that, okay, so I have my regular work day and then I do the interviews at night. And that does not really sort of talk about work-life balance. That's not putting things in balance at all. So it is quite demanding because it's not only the interview, it's preparation, it's a sort of transcription of the notes and so on. So I think I also had to mentally train myself to think I'm actually doing field work now. I cannot also be writing papers and preparing teaching and so on. So just to say that it's not a phone call to your mom. It requires a lot more. Great.
Let's do the same thing, a couple of questions, and then we move on to Helene's presentation.
Yeah.
You talked about GDPR and how you could transfer the data to Finland.
Yeah.
But then you also said you use some, very common platforms like WhatsApp.
Yeah.
Zoom. I'm pretty sure Cave does not have any agreements with Meta or any of the other owners of these. So how did you secure the data while you're doing the interviews and still working according to GDPR?
Well, most of the interview. That's a good question, and I might not have sort of complied completely. The interviews were live, right? So we communicate via audio messages and so on WhatsApp, but that's only for the dialogue. And the dialogue could also be that would also be sort of about our kids or something, so much more mundane stuff. The interviews in themselves were always live, mostly on Zoom. I didn't record them. I've taken notes.
Yeah, but still using the platform.
Yeah. Yeah. I must admit I don't know the exact when it's live. I don't know whether it can be. Yeah. Good.
Yeah, so now this is the second presentation, so we can formulate some questions. At the opening, Tove put this workshop in the context of security or maybe insecurity, which in my context or in my view associate on rapid changes of a situation and then on a need for a very fast response, for example, to maybe transform or augment a method. We see that as the COVID-19 crisis started with the teaching with students abroad. So both your presentation and
Maria.
yeah, imply that they are laid on a very well established infrastructure, contacts, long-term cooperation, and so on.
Yeah.
So can you comment on your experience on, and also maybe Maria, on rapid changes, because we are experiencing that it actually may compromise the data quality and it also changes the budget, because then you kind of not necessarily lessen the work of the northern side, but you certainly increase the man months of the south side. So if you can comment on these two questions, thanks.
Do you want me to start? Or
Yeah, no, I think that in terms of, I think we didn't experience, so it was not a rapid change, right? Because first we were sent home, basically cold. So the situation, of course, in Argentina and Peru is not comparable to, it's not a conflict situation. So the change that we experienced was due to COVID-19. And that gave us a little bit of, because I think we were waiting first to see that I think we had also to realize how long this would last. I don't think we realized that in the beginning. So these were not rapid changes. These were gradual changes for us. But I think when we make changes in the strategy of collecting data, we'll always compromise certain things, but enhance other things. For me, I think what I've really realized especially from the last project, is how useful these online conversations were in order for me to get to arrive well in the field once I could do that. So I spent a month in Argentina. It has been recently, but I spent 2 years in dialogue before that, continuous dialogue, and that actually meant that my time in the field was tremendously efficient in terms of collecting data, because we already knew each other quite well. So it felt like I've done long-term field works, and this felt like a long sort of half a year into a normal field work for me. I'm not sure that it exactly replied to your question, but maybe you have.
it's
Yeah.
just a few things. I think the answer to your question was in your question, and I agree with you that we need to be flexible, both in terms of timing of activities and budget. And we had sudden changes in Burkina with regards to security. So some communities that had been selected where we should conduct fieldwork were not safe anymore. So of course, we're not sending the local researchers there when it's unsafe. So we need to be flexible and think, okay, should we change communities? Should we wait and then see if it gets better? But it costs, right? Because they're getting paid while we're waiting. And so I would say an advice would be, if you know you're working in a difficult field condition, don't overload the project, but allow for flexibility in moving the activities around and a buffer in terms of funding also. But you said it yourself, so I agree with you. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. My question has to do with sometimes, from my experience, if you're interviewing somebody for a short period of time, the fellow may, because he or she knows that he did the interview, may try to give you some responses that in actual sense is not the case. And when you are in the field, you are able to observe certain things yourself. So now that you are conducting interviews by phone, how do you try to synchronize what the respondent is said against what maybe you might have observed on the story, or you are accepted as one of the invitations that doing your
Yeah. Well, I think I'm not sure that this is any much different from a regular interview, that I would never let interview data stand alone. Always triangulate it and think about it in relation to other kinds of data. These interviews are about sort of trying to understand how does the world make sense from that particular position. It's not about finding sort of a truth in itself. But sure, you're right that there should be an that's why these interviews are part of a variety of both interviews, talking to several people, but also other sources of knowledge. Did that reply your question? Answer your question?
But my concern was that sometimes people, when they know that interviews, they may give you responses which are not in reality the case. So that when you are in the field, you are able to observe certain things yourself. So even if the respondent is not giving you accurate responses, there are certain things that you are able to observe. So my concern now is, how do you, because the interview is conducted by phone, you are not unable to observe. So how do you know what the respondent is telling you is actually what is on the ground? Or you will accept it as one of the...
Yeah, but that I think I tried to say that before when I said that I don't think that my point about the interview is not to get a specific truth, but it's about getting that person's version of vision of position of this, right? And this knowledge is cumulative, so it builds up through the interviews. And I can, of course, get back. Of course, people can say something which is absurdly untrue, and you're right that I cannot check that. I cannot check whether that person was at that conflict at that particular time. But I think having multiple interviews, knowing what has happened, other sources of what's happening and so on, and then getting to the field at some point. And that's also why I said that this requires continuity and commitment, that the interview should not stand alone, and that the online interview is not something that can stand on its own feet, but only makes sense when you have other sources of information and when you are able to get there as well.
Okay, I think we should let Matthias get off the hook and put Helene up here on the hook. Give a presentation that will give us a little bit of time before lunch, maybe to do more questions and answers.
Det er så fint. Hej. Jeg ved ikke, hvorfor jeg sendte den igen. Det er fordi, jeg havde glemt, at jeg havde sendt den i fredags. Det er så fint. So while Lars-Arne is working on the technology, I want to thank for the initiative taken by Christian and Tove and Rive, because I think it's really important. And I've been given 3 different tasks to look at secure data storage and also to how we do ethnographic research in the cyberspace online, and also talk a little bit about how to adjust research teams to highly insecure context. And I want to start by saying that I'm no expert in this field. I'm going to share my experiences of getting an FFU-funded project in December 2020, 2 months before a military coup was staged in Myanmar, which made research both a question of physical insecurity and also digital insecurity. And the last year, I've been finalizing our previous FFU-funded project, EverJust, And then over the past months, I've tried together with the research team in Myanmar. Some of them are now in Thailand. One is on the way to Denmark because of the situation. To restructure our research. We are all anthropologists, and we really like to sit under the tree and talk to people, or in the slum areas, or amongst the armed groups. So we are kind of used to working in insecure and conflict-affected places of Myanmar, but we are not used to working in a context where actually we cannot do that ordinary kind of physical research. And that's not just me. I can't even get into the country, partly because I'm foreign, but also because I've chosen early on to speak up against the military atrocities in Danish and international media and so on and so forth. But also for our Myanmar researchers, impossible to go physically in the field in secure and responsible ways. We also have a situation in Myanmar where digital insecurity is extremely high. So I will also be talking to that topic. I would say that as a point of departure, moving into this whole remote and digital ethnography was a little bit by, we don't have a choice. Oh no, I'm 47, I have to reinvent myself because the context has changed, and the same in our team. It was out of necessity, but I think as we are moving into this space, we are also realizing that we have already done some of it before, at least the last year. We've done quite a bit of research that are using some of these remote and digital methods, but also actually looking ourselves in the mirror and say, well, social reality is already online. I mean, why haven't we even started to reflect on how this has been part of our data collection for a long time? So I think at least the last 1.5 years, we've been doing a lot of this ad hoc, or I would say since the COVID pandemic, but not really reflecting on what we were doing, and also not thinking together the digital and the physical questions of security. So I would start I would talk us a bit through that. And as I said, please don't take me as an expert in this field, but someone who wants to reflect with you on some of the things that we have done. I want to, before I move the slide, just to say that one of the big questions that we have talked about in our research team, we are 12 people, there is me in Australia and the rest are Myanmar researchers, is should we at all do research on Myanmar? Because it's so dangerous for the researchers, it is dangerous for our research participants, whether it's in the online space or it's physically. And of course, we are all trained in the do no harm, and we all support the principles of do no harm. But continuously, we are faced with, if we give up and don't do research in these contexts, we are also part of silencing the voices of people and the experiences in these contexts. And as I'm sure you're also following with regards to Ukraine, the same was with Afghanistan, Myanmar. Most of you probably don't know that there's still huge atrocities going on there because the media picture is full of Ukraine for good reasons now, but still also, of course, regrettably that there's no space for other places, that we as researchers actually also have an ethical obligation to try to not silence what's going on. So we, instead of saying, no, do no harm, it's better to say we don't do research, we have to do it in intelligent, to use Christian's phrase, and secure ways. And I think that's really also one of the purposes of being here today, at least as I have understood. So let me, oh, now I'm doing something wrong. Is it the mouse that I have to use? I can also try here. Aha! So the first question I was given is how to secure data in the cloud in real time. And this, in working in a context where there's conflict, armed conflict is of course one thing where we are facing physical questions of physical security, but actually increasingly in a lot of the countries we work, the physical forms of oppression, whether it's by militaries or authoritarian states, is also combined with digital forms of oppression. I think Russia, of course, is on your mind now because this is what we see in the media all the time, but a lot of repressive regimes are also increasingly using cyberspace as a means to control critical thinking and so on. And this also extends to the research space. And here we are talking about questions that go way beyond GDPR, which of course we have to follow because we are living in the European context, and also the ordinary research ethics. We have a responsibility to think about the security, both the physical and the digital, of the people we work with in the South, but also the people we talk with. And I think the second principle here is that we really need to start by understanding the particular context that we're working in, because the security risks are very different from context to context. So, for example, in Myanmar at the moment, you can actually end up in 3 years in prison by using VPN. VPN is illegal, for example, in Russia and China, and VPN is necessary to protect yourself against repressive authorities arresting you for saying something critical of the regime, which is also criminalized. So this is just to give you an example. We need to know this context. Are researchers actually a target in these? Which topics of research are a target? I can tell you that right now, my colleagues, when they leave their home, they either leave their device at home or they erase their apps before they go out, because you can be checked at checkpoints in the streets where your Facebook profile will be scrolled through to see if you are saying anything critical about the military. This is a very extreme situation. The situation might be much leaner in other contexts. Maybe it's only high-profile researchers that are the targets. So understanding that context before you decide on what do you do with secure data, what do we do with our research data is extremely important. We have considerably changed our budget. All the big physical conferences and seminars, not all of them, but a lot of them, has partly been transformed into investing in the right devices and courses in storing our data, sharing our data securely. So we've actually started with a tailor-made digital security course, and I think this was mentioned earlier on, is that we have to realize that when we are venturing into this space, you can't take for granted. I mean, certainly not me. Some of the younger Myanmar researchers, they learn it much quicker, but that it also requires a whole new set of skills to enter into this space. And then it requires, it was said earlier, not only buying the right devices, but also looking into the context of what kind of encrypted setups do you need. So we were, for example, for data sharing, storage, and also where we can edit, and it's instant steering, we were recommended this app called Teller, which is highly encrypted, which for the moment would be the right solution in Myanmar, because when you, for example, store your research data, it's shared instantly with researchers in the north, but it also means that when you go out on the street, you can erase the app and reinstall it when you come back. And you can also be big teams. So this is one of the solutions that are being developed now. It's quite new. It's only right now being developed for Apple products. And this is, of course, for context where shared Google Drives is not an option because it's simply not safe enough. In our research team, we have also bought Proton Mail, we've bought VPN. I know it's illegal in Myanmar, but that is the only way that people can sit and use actually the Facebook. So a whole set of encrypted and secure digital devices and apps that we are investing in. And of course, the question then comes, where does all this data go? And what we've been recommended by these security advice that we've had is that we choose a place where there's a safe hard disk. And we have an agreement that we send and then we erase. I can give you an example of a recent project that I did on soldier defections in Myanmar, which is a highly sensitive topic because the military in Myanmar doesn't like that their soldiers defect. So that's obvious. So what we build up the research in Myanmar and is that she would send the stuff to me, and then she would expect me within 5 hours to say received, and then she erased on her side. So you build up these kind of systems. Of course, that's rest a lot on trust. I like some of the recommendations previously that building up teams around this kind of security really is dependent on you knowing the people you're working with in the South already, and not starting to build up new research teams would be quite highly challenging. I think the last point I put up here is also like our IT expert at D said, well, the Russians and the Chinese can eventually, they can go through all systems. It doesn't matter how encrypted and how much you pay and what you set up. So I think it's not like you have your security data set up, and then that's all fine. And in the next 5 years, we just roll with that. We have to engage with digital security experts sort of an ongoing basis and ask them if we are still using the right things. Because, for example, very recently, Telegram was known to be a really good space in Myanmar where the opposition could exchange views, and then suddenly they gave data to the military junta because apparently it's mainly owned by Russian something. Anyway, just to say that we need to continuously reassess the systems that we are using. So the other question I was given, and of course, this must happen within a space where we have all these devices and setups of secure data, so we do not put people at risk, was how do you do research on social media platforms? So our project, My Climate, funded by FU, is focusing on the climate change and conflict nexus. And of course, we would very much like to have gone straight out in the field, in the contested border regions, ethnic minority areas, and looked at this in the practical space. But the context of Myanmar doesn't allow us to do that. And as I said before, that was, of course, a big bummer for us, forcing us to say, okay, what can we do? And in the beginning, it was like a bit, by default, but we actually found out that also because of the conflict situation, not only us as researchers are going even more in the digital space, but also within this whole space of indigenous struggles, climate change, conflict debates, discussions of the military coup, that there is actually an increase in online activity. Not everything is in public spaces. Some of it has moved into private spaces, which of course we would need to get our way into if we were to research that space. So actually we have decided in our research project to start in the online space and to start to map out what kind of actors are active in this field, what kind of groups, public and private, what localities are active in this space, and also what topics can we look into. So we have both kind of taken an actor site-based and topic-based approach to look at social media groups. And at the moment, we are in the process of this huge mapping using different keywords and topics on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram to try to map out the space of who is active there, and then from that choose our sub topics. I can, for example, give you one example. At the moment, what we are seeing, which is going to be a really interesting research topic under the climate conflict nexus question, is that a lot of the indigenous movements have actually strengthened their mobilization in the joint resistance and opposition to the military coup, using climate change and indigenous forms of conservation as a resistance strategy. Super interesting topic. And this is something we're able to identify to begin with only in the online space. But of course, we'll, as I will come back to, there are also possibilities to move beyond that. When we are working in that space, depending on the security situation, we might choose to use only passive observation. If it turns out to be too insecure to even be in that space, we have decided to have like a public Facebook group for our project, but there might be situations where it can be too dangerous to do actual participant observation in that space. And again, that depends on the security assessments along the way. And then the last thing I've written here is sustaining ethnographic immersion and sensibility. And that might be a bit strange. I mean, at least for me, you know, I'm like grew up with Malinowski. That's the only kind of real fieldwork on. And then there was some multi-sided fieldwork at some point, but it was like still very this ethnographic. So is it even valuable? Is it just something we're doing because we can't do anything else? And we've been reading in our team quite a lot of different digital ethnography stuff. And I think the kind of principles we work with in ethnography of continuous reflection, of getting the actor voices out, on understanding forms of in and exclusion, on telling people stories. I think some of those principles are still extremely valid in the digital space, even if the relations you build can be quite different than the ones you build when you are physically together with people. But that's definitely one of the principles that we will be working with. So our ambition in the long run is to combine research on social media platforms with some kind of remote ethnography and some of the methods that have been mentioned here today. We also have on our list photo voice and also in chatnography, which is a little bit like the phone interviews, but it's actually more instant, where we have more continuous contact with research participants. So what we have already started now is we've identified groups and topics to follow on social media platforms, but both because some of the groups are less active because they're afraid of being persecuted by the military, we have already started to use the online space as a form of snowballing, contacting administrators of groups, followers. I'm meeting some of them actually now in Chiang Mai in Thailand next week, so that we are building up these enclaves on networks that will enable us both to follow the online life, but also to meet people in person and to do the kind of also Zoom interviews that you were speaking about. So again, the ambition is to have different sources of data being able to triangulate within that field. And we're very inspired by our course trainer, I'll come back to that later, who trained us in all this, who is Hilary Fax, and she works with this idea about from cloud to ground to cloud. I mean, this switching between working in the online space and doing more remote kinds of ethnography, and then, if possible, also meeting people physically. And of course, it's a little bit back to some of the questions that came before. I mean, as I learned by my old PhD supervisor, who is sitting right there, you know, you have to just remember to ask the right questions. Don't ask questions that you methodologically can't gather data in connection to. And I think that's a principle that runs through any kind of research. But I think here as well, there will be questions that cannot be answered in the same way in the digital space as it can when you meet people physically. But I think this thinking about not like you either work in the cloud and then that's a completely different social reality from working in the physical space, but thinking how you can switch between ground and cloud is really also an ambition of our research in the long term. And we do also, we've worked many years in Myanmar already, so the idea is to combine our digital research with also working with local research assistants. But again, that's also a question of continuously reassessing the security situation. So one step at the time, and luckily we get long-term research projects in FFU and not just 1 or 2 years like in other project cycles. So of course there's a lot of, I call it reflections. I had put it like caveats or challenges, but now I put reflections on digital ethnography. And of course I started out myself being extremely skeptical of doing this kind of research or even calling it ethnography. And I think what I've realized is, I've told you already this before, that it's not, you know, online lives are not separate from social life. I just have to look at myself, but I just wasn't reflective about it before. But also that during crisis, like extreme crisis, like in Myanmar, this is also a very moving space. Some people will be more active on social media, some people will be in hiding, others will be less active. So also the dynamism of this field is something we have learned just in these initial phases. Then there's the big question of inclusion and exclusion. So this is also part of our mapping at the moment, who is actually online and who is not. It tends to be quite elitist, even if a lot of people have smartphones now. It's you, the rural farmers, women, they are not necessarily, also because they are more afraid perhaps to be in that space. The diaspora, of course, is the most active people who are in safe spaces because of the digital insecurity situation in Myanmar. So very important to continuously be reflective of whose voices and activities are represented in the online kind of data collection. We are also mapping out these questions of inactivity and activity, which groups were active before the crisis but are now inactive. We see also those who are active that they themselves erase postings on social media groups, especially the public ones. So there are questions around how do we deal with that as researchers? Do we say that? Do we make screenshots of previous postings? And this links, of course, up to questions about ethics and security in the way that we source and use our data. So in principle, in digital ethnography, when we're talking about public spaces on Facebook, for example, you can use it however you want in principle, whereas in private groups, you should not take screenshots and you should just make ordinary sort of anthropological field notes. But there is an increasing concern that we also have an ethical responsibility, the way that we use the public group postings, because people are not necessarily aware of what longer term security repercussions to people's public platforms have. So this is something that must be part of continuous reflections. Then there's the rabbit hole, and I'm sure that you are also aware of that in your work, is that when you do digital ethnography, it never stops. You can chat with people 24/7, you can sit on these social media. So there is really, if there is always a question in research of defining your field and delimiting your field, you have to do the same in the digital space, and you have to be even harsher because it's like an endless place of data. So you have to select, of course, not only the groups you follow, but also the postings and stuff. Then you have to be aware of people's online and offline identities. Again, we can look at ourselves in the mirror, you know, how do we behave differently as part of the reflections. And I think that the last point is really key, and I feel that it's fortunate to work in big teams that we do in FFU projects, because really reflecting continuously about both the work we do in the digital space, but also the security around it is really key, and that you can do it as teams is, of course, even better than sitting by yourself. So the last thing that I've been asked to do, and I think I've already said quite a bit about it, is how are we dealing then in our little research group, My Climate Research Group. One of the first things we did is realize that we don't know much about this. So we got Hilary Faxon, who's actually coming, I think, still to Copenhagen, right, Christian? She has been training geographers and ethnographers in digital and remote ethnography, and we were very lucky that she actually did research on Myanmar as well, so that was lucky for us. She can speak even a bit of Burmese. So we've just gone through an intensive course with her, and it wasn't just a lecturing, but where we actually, very interactive course where we built up cases, we started to look for groups, we had these very open reflections on ethics. So really recommendable if you're doing this kind of work that you do it in a reflective way, and that it does require skills training. Even though we are all, I don't speak on all of you, but at least in my part, used to Twitter and Facebook. And then we, this was on initiative from the Myanmar researchers. We also had in our setting up of data security, this is going on at the moment, a security course in data security, which is actually run by a Myanmar NGO that is funded by an American NGO. So they are doing the training for free. So we are quite lucky. Others might need to source it from outside, so that it's not just about how we work in the digital space, but also taking into consideration the individual security concerns. And actually, this is tailor-made to the Myanmar context, and it's tailor-made also to the individual researchers. So this trainer is actually doing individual interviews with, let's say, the anthropology professor who is sitting in Yangon and whose situation is ABC, so that it's very tailor-made to that particular country and that particular researchers. And we don't meet, of course, physically. So a big part of our teamwork is to have these weekly Zoom debriefing meetings. But also, as you can see over here, that we are, I think today already we have like 40 exchanges that every day we are actually on Signal, which is an encrypted app where we are in constant contact in the research team, sharing events to follow, but also people's individual security concerns. How are you feeling today? Oh, I had to move there, or now they're targeting that. So that it's always part of the reflections, the security situation as well. So I think I'll stop there because I'm sure I've taken too much time, but I was also given 3 questions. So, and I look forward to questions and also our joint discussion.
Let's take a few questions for Helene. There's time for that, if you have.
Mike?
When you were forced to rethink how you were going to do your research after the military coup, one of the things that you mentioned was a virtual university.
Yeah.
You haven't mentioned that here,
No.
and I'm kind of curious because a lot of what you're saying suggests that there's a movement online and a sort of disconnect from the traditional university setup in Myanmar. Could you say a few words about where that virtual university is going?
Yeah. So there are 2 things in our project. The one is, of course, that Yangon University, which we were supposed to work with, is like under the military now. So a lot of the researchers took part in the strike and left it. So some of these researchers from the classic university are now part of creating these virtual universities. A lot of the students from universities do not want to go to the university because it's under the military. Some are in hiding. So the virtual universities is sort of part of sustaining the intellectual capacity in Myanmar, both amongst the teachers, but also the students. And we are also going to engage strongly with them, both to offer lecturing, and some of the professors are already doing that at the moment. So that's one part of it. And the other part is, of course, the physical forms of resettlement that we have had to do in our project and involve universities, for example, in Thailand and Research Institute in Northeast India. So the combination of the virtual with physical safe intellectual spaces in the region. So the combination of that is something the capacity sort of building part of the FFU is very closely connected to doing both those things. Yeah.
I mean, this is extremely interesting. I'm just sort of wondering, also based on some concrete experiences, in particular with Myanmar, but who actually gives you clearance to work with a particular person or institution?
So in the original application before the coup, it was, of course, it's approved by my own institutes, and then also when you send the application and eventually by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at the end of the day. But in terms of our readjustment here, we had to make an actual readjustment project description where it also mentioned the new partners. That's also why Mike knows it, because he's probably read the readjustments. The virtual university and so on. So it's approved by the funder, but at the moment in Myanmar, it's not approved by those sitting in the capital city and on the parliamentary buildings because they are an illegal military junta, and this is also recognized by the Danish government and Ministry of Foreign Affairs that we don't work with them. So So it is a research NGO we work with, and then our partners in the region.
So the individuals in those institutions have also been approved.
Yes, yeah. The named researchers are always, and they have to also sign that they're part of the project. Yeah.
So, apologies for my voice, I will try to yell. But we also worked on a project in Myanmar since 2017, and with the Bangkok Technological University, working with garment factories. And what we experienced after Corona started, that we had to do the remote teaching and we had to do interventions in garment factories, was that our local colleagues from Yangon Technological University, they had to do all the pilot testing of our method in factories on their own. And it also had some very good outcomes. They felt more empowered about the process and took more ownership of the project as a total. The project has been paused now because of the coup. But so did you also experience during digital, like having to do it like in these digital platforms, that there was also some positive outcomes of that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we haven't experienced with the remote research except for like Matthias was doing the interview during the COVID, because we are still finding our way of how to do that during this very insecure situation in Myanmar right now. But definitely, and I think Marie was also speaking about it, that it's also action research and can be very empowering, especially for research participants who are able to make these kind of diaries and photo voice. And I mean, there's a whole set, which we were also trained in this course, a whole set of remote ethnography techniques that support sort of more active participation of research, but rather than sitting in the more structured interview. So I think there are definitely some advantages to that we will also try to exploit, but we haven't kind of reached the place where we feel safe enough to do that yet. We have to be very careful in our selection of the areas. There are some areas in Myanmar where, I mean, it's like in Kiev, you know, people are sitting in hiding, you know, or fleeing, and then there are other places that are more safe. So we are starting to identify where can we begin. We are beginning to actually maybe think about that our field sites are these what are now called the liberated areas, which are under the ethnic armed organizations on the Thai border, Chin State, and so finding place to do the research, but still also having the do no harm in clearly as a key principle, right?
It's very interesting to hear each of your presentations, and extremely encouraging to hear also from you about how these different field methods can also unleash some energy from the researchers based in the south and give them more of a voice in the design of the activities. I'm wondering about the security aspects for the national researchers. You talked about it and you've elaborated on it. But is it safe enough? And also, would they always have the necessary security awareness? Is that something you can take for granted, or is this an area where we, as Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Leader Fellowship Center, should focus more on ensuring appropriate training coming out of their countries, and then before they start working there? Can you just assume that they can protect themselves?
No, that's also why this data security training that they are undergoing now, the South researchers, is really key. And I mean, we are just super lucky that there's this Myanmar NGO that was given some donor funding to do that to all to journalists and to researchers. And no, I definitely think that, I mean, just as Danish researchers have to take a heat course when they travel to insecure context, this should be definitely part of the security budget, and the course that is so tailor-made to Myanmar right now. I think that is the right question. It's not some generalized heat course. I think from the short experience I have now with Myanmar, if one can get country-specific courses that really understands that particular context, because there will be, armed conflict countries where digital security is maybe not such a big problem, but in Myanmar, it's like part of the arsenal they learned from the Russians and the Chinese, right? So it's just as dangerous to post things on Facebook as it is to walk past a place where they have, are firing arms. So you need that tailor-made security. Yeah.
May I follow up? I mean, specifically related to this, because it's a very, very key issue, and then it relates back to ethics, approvals,
Yeah.
GDPR, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just sort of wondering, I mean, who gave ethical approval for the project that you're doing?
I don't have an ethical approval except the rules that we follow at these, but I don't have an external institution that gives that ethical
So
approval.
even within these, there's no.
Within
committee,
these, we have the
ethical
research.
independent
We have the
research.
research committee that approves ethics and GDP and makes sure that we are following or that we have chosen the specific GDPR route. So we have that, but there's no like higher standing ethical committee that gives us a piece of paper. I don't think there is that in Denmark, or what?
Yes and no.
Yeah. But I think these questions are way beyond research ethics.
But you touched upon these questions, I mean, with your
Yeah.
presentation, so I was wondering similarly, how
Yeah,
did
yeah.
you get approval to map the social media?
Yeah, we don't have that kind of in Denmark where they do it in UK and US, right? You have these ethical boards that I don't think we have it in Denmark.
We're on the outer limits of what I know something
Yeah.
about.
But it's good we raised the question,
But
right?
I can say what I know. Sort of ethical clearance used to be something that doctors did at the University of Copenhagen. And it's very recent that there's been an ethical committee put in place that covers all aspects of science. There are many still ongoing projects that never went through an ethical clearance at the University of Copenhagen. I think the reason it becomes more urgent, I'm almost embarrassed to say, it's not because of war in the world, but that's because journals begin to demand to see your ethical clearance in order to publish. So it is getting more and more part of the trade here. But I will say, without offending anybody I know well, that the ethical clearance system at the University of Copenhagen is still highly geared toward research that involves human bodies. So it's medical, it's psychology, if you work with children and so on. But ethical clearance for development studies in a broad sense is not a specialized field. I had a project ethically cleared because the ethical board was put in place after I'd started the project. So halfway through, I went through ethical clearance, and it was not. It didn't seem to be the key objective of that committee to look at broader social science research methods for ethical clearance. Then I haven't said too much, right? But I think it is coming, and I think the pressure comes from publishing houses more than from actual security questions. Jakob, you should. Yeah. We have a little bit of time, and then I'll give you an assignment for lunch.
I don't know if I managed to formulate this as a question, but it's a
Sorry,
question. In my own research,
Jamen, du må gerne. Det er da hyggeligt.
presentation, maybe as much to Togan as Arne, about data extraction. So it is an ethical question. Because when during COVID we had an excuse to do remote research online, we asked local researchers, of course we need this to ensure their security, but to provide us data in different ways. Now, with increased focus on research in crisis situation, in conflict situation, and we have the capacity, we've proven over 2 years of COVID that actually it's possible. So now we don't need to travel. That is somewhat contradictory to developments in social science where actually we need to build up the capacity amongst our research interlocutors and research assistants in and around the world. So how do we deal with that, and how can we meet that challenging if we're asking to do more research in these circumstances? I don't have the answer, but it's somewhat a contradictory trend that it's possible for us, yet there is a push from the south that we actually build up that capacity. And of course, if Helena, in some ways, you have some answers to that, to your specific context, where it's about, not silencing the voices. In other contexts, that can be something else. But how are we put to that challenge? And maybe as an associated question to that, if it requires strong network, if it requires 10 years of knowledge of the field, we sit here as mid and late career scholars. What for young Danish field work?
Yeah, it's terrible.
How do we build that, the new generation?
It's a huge problem.
Maria knows.
Yeah, no, of course. No, I can only speak about my experience. I think the questions you raise are really valid. Based on my experience, conducting remote research because of security issues or COVID doesn't lead to less capacity building. That also means that the connection between Danish researchers and local partners is not diminished. Actually, it's maybe augmented. It's online, right? Or in our case, we could meet with our local partners in Burkina in northern Ghana. So we actually also met physically. So the project I presented is not funded by FFU. It's funded by the Innovation Foundation. But if it was an FFU project, I would of course ensure that the PhD students that are part of the project would come for very long stays in Denmark, so you can actually, participate in the supervision of those projects. And so I don't think that it needs to lead to less capacity building. But that's based on my experience.
We have one last question, and then
I'm sorry to write the GDPR horse here today. I have another question regarding that. We talked a lot about data extraction. In our work at our university here, we're working a lot on collaborative projects. So there's a lot of sharing of data between North and South. And we're not allowed to do that with most of the systems that are available to us due to GDPR reasons. So I wonder if anyone solved that and cracked the nut.
We are allowed to do it as long as it's completely anonymized. We can share the data between South and North, and it has to be in the partnership contracts in the FFU projects that the partners in South have the responsibility to follow the GDPR rules and have the responsibility for the data. And then we are allowed to share.
But which platforms are you using?
Yeah, that's what we are figuring out now because of the security situation. And I said early on that we're going to try out this Teller because it's highly encrypted. And that actually is very good because the GDPR rules also requires that it's fully encrypted. Either that you log it into your... Okay.
I'm sorry, but I mean, just to be very, very clear, the GDPR rules applied to social science research makes it illegal to transfer data back.
Exactly.
You're not allowed to. It's simply illegal.
Okay, then we have a gap in what we've heard of.
And there is a series of really difficult issues here. The only way in which we have been able to, in quote, get around it is that the data are still owned.
Yes, that's what I mean.
Country,
yeah.
But then you get a copy.
Yes.
And you're not allowed to give anything back. Nothing.
Yeah, that I've heard, but it doesn't mean you can't share data.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What we were told was that we could bring our laptops to the South and sit and work on those because we're not sharing it.
We're not sharing it.
But I mean, that's not It's not a good solution.
Yeah, but we can have a full 3-day workshop on GDPR because I think there's a lot of different ways of tackling it institutionally as well. So that I think there's a big gap there.
Okay, so now the plan is lunch. But as you all know, there's no such thing as a free lunch. So what I want you to do while you are talking to people you know or people you don't know is to think about what the hell do we do? How should we keep ourselves informed about developing new smart methods and their pitfalls? How should this research community somehow communicate and share experience? Do we do this every once in a while? Does DFC establish a kind of repository over methods? How do we share this experience? Because however lovely it's been these couple of hours, they will have passed by now, and we will need to figure out how we do this in a more regular way. So if you take a sandwich, you're supposed to be able to answer these questions when we get back. Right? So we will get back here and start again at 1. We'll do a short wrap up of the morning, and then we'll move directly to the security issue for researchers. Thank you very much for the presenters so far, and enjoy your lunch.
Where are those?